We're getting ready for the march. We've got tribes, 3 tribes on each side of the tabernacle and the Levites in the middle. And we're getting closer and closer all the time. Remember that the Kohathites, they were not supposed to touch the holy things, but they were in charge of carrying them. And even when Aaron and the priest were getting these things bundled, the Kohathites couldn't look at them lest they die. And that was in chapter 15 through 19, chapter 4. And then we got into that whole interesting thing about the woman who's caught in adultery, that the man who thought his wife was cheating on her could bring her, and the priest would make this bitter water, and that bitter water was made from some dirt underneath the tabernacle, because that dirt with the tabernacle was considered holy. That water was made. There was the words that the priest wrote. He put that in the water, and then she would die if she had been guilty of that. That bitter water would bring remembrance. It would bring something, and she would have her thigh rot off. So, now we're in chapter 6. We'll move along a little bit quicker this time. So chapter 6 of the book of Numbers. So that chapter, chapter 6, it's going to go over how you become a Nazarite. You're going to devote yourself to God through this Nazarite vow. And so who's the most well-known Nazarene? Samson. Yeah. So the Nazarite vow, you let your hair grow out, do not let a razor touch it. You also stay away from strong drink and vinegars. You really don't even get around the grape or the vine of the grape very much. And one other thing is, do you remember the other thing potentially that Samson taught us you're not supposed to be around? Yeah, you're not supposed to even be near one, but you particularly touch one because you're defiled. And if a Nazarene or someone took this vow, if they ended up touching this or being around a dead body, they had to start their vow over again. And it doesn't give us any detail about the specific time of how long this duration was, but it was pretty long. So if you're a Nazarene or wanted to be separating yourself apart, and you actually or end up accidentally being beside a dead person, somebody dies right beside you, you've got to start that process back over again. You have to start your hair back over again. If you go into verses 13 through 21, it talks about once that time has completed. Again, I don't have any details on how long this period of really consecrating yourself to be a Nazarene, to have this Nazarite vow. At the end of that, you cut your hair off, and then you burn it to the Lord. Jason? Yes. Didn't Samson kill a son of Yeah, Samson's a whole different story, and I'm probably not. He did a lot of things he shouldn't have done, a whole lot of things, including the ladies. Yeah. That's beyond my ability to really give you much of a good answer, other than the fact that Samson did a lot of things he shouldn't have done. Yeah, I think that's a great question, for sure. We often refer to the time that he touched, what was it, a bear that was dead, that had honey in it or something? A lion, okay, yeah. He touched that, and I think he got in trouble for that, but yeah, he did kill people, didn't he? So, I don't know. Yeah, I couldn't really speak to that. Anybody, Bob, ever discuss that? That would be that's one of those things where you corner Barry, and you just see how nervous he gets. Is that when the character died, the Lord gave him the strength to do that? Well, he was, yeah. Yeah. All right. I knew I might get some questions about that, but there's not anything that I'm aware of on that. So we're going through this chapter 6 pretty rapidly because it's got some very specific detail in what this vow brings to the table of what you're supposed to do. In verses 22 through 27, and there's special blessings of the priest on the people of Israel. And so let's just jump right into chapter 7. So you recall that in chapter 7, you recall something that maybe last week, when they were doing the numbering, they had a special person that was supposed to help number that particular tribe, and they were called a prince. So in chapter 7 here, they have the princes are going to bring something to the Levites. They're going to bring some gifts to Moses, and they bring, as it says in verses 1 through 9, 6 wagons and 12 oxen. And they bring this to them, and Moses gives it to the Gershonites and the Merarites. And it's going to help them tote these soft goods and these hard goods, meaning the poles for the tabernacle and all of the things that make the structure, and the soft goods would be more of the obviously the things that go over it in a soft manner, not the poles and things of that nature. But the Kohathites, guess what? They didn't get any oxen. They didn't get any wagons because they're supposed to carry it. This is how they're just super separated in what they're supposed to do. You've got the Levites already set apart as special people for God, but then the Kohathites carrying the holy things, not pulling it with carts, not pulling it with oxen. And so, just an interesting side note for those guys. They're supposed to carry it, not touch it, not look at it. All very, very specific. So one thing we can just think about is that when we try to apply these things to us in the church for what God has appointed for us, God, you look at this detail here in the book of Numbers, he took this exceptionally important, and the Levites knew that this was exceptionally important. All of Israel did. You're talking about if you look at the holy things, you die. If you touch them, you die. They understood these things. This was exceptionally important. When we meet here in an hour, or less now, it's exceptionally important to God. How much more important is our worship now, even than it was then? Because now we have Christ. Now we have the blessings that we can't even really imagine. We take them for granted. But in those days, you're talking about 8,000 people getting the tabernacle ready for service, the thousands upon thousands of animals that were needed to be brought in and harvested through these sacrifices. You're talking about a huge number of animals. 3 million people, 8,000 servants for Aaron. This is no small thing. And what we do here in an hour is beautiful. It is supposed to be holy before God. And we try to do it in a way that He wants it. Isn't that awesome? It should give us some serious soberness. When the Bible here in Numbers tells us you can't look at the holy things, you can't touch the holy things, guess what? They knew that. They understood it. They absolutely knew it and understood it. And when the Bible tells us we need to worship a certain way, boy, we should know that. And we've got to respect it. And that's God's love for us, because guess what? In the book of Numbers, God's trying to get the people closer to Him. What about us? The same thing. He's trying to get us closer to Him. And we do it the way He wants it. And that should be beautiful. Absolutely a wonderful thing to think about. All right. In verse 89 of that chapter 7, it says, God speaks to Moses from above the mercy seat. It says this, my notes here, this phrase should have really been part of the next chapter. So we're going to get into some things that are ordination of the Levites. You've got some detail here about lighting the lampstands in verses 1 through 4, the consecration of the Levites. And basically what that means, the Levites need to be making themselves clean. Remember, we still have not gotten on this march yet. We're just simply in the organizational mode here. Organizational mode. Still getting the Levites ready to be the special set-apart people serving the rest of Israel to honor God and take the service of the tabernacle. All right. Verse 10, the children of Israel shall lay their hands on the Levites. So the Levites are almost going to be a kind of a wave offering. If you remember anything back from Leviticus, there are some wave offerings. You would hold up something and you would have a wave offering before God. The Levites are going to be a wave offering as well. There's going to be a laying on of the hands. In verses 23 through 26 in chapter 8, the Levitical priest period of service is set at 25 to 50 years of age. So there's a specific time and age for these Levitical priests to serve, 25 to 50. So the numbers can get confusing, but remember that the context here is that God's got some specific things. He's doing this and giving us specifics, the Israelites anyway, for certain reasons. And remember that the Levitical priesthood, the thing that we can apply for here is, you know, when we read the book of Numbers by ourselves and we're just trying to think about it, the first few times we read this book, it's like, why in the world does this matter to me and the price of tea in China? The Levites were set apart and consecrated, and that's just a foreshadowing of us. When we come out as obedient believers of the waters of baptism, we are pure and holy and set apart for God. And that's why we go through the process of obeying the gospel, is so that we can be right in the sight of God. It's the same thing here for the Levites. Pure and without sin. And we stay faithful when we do what He wants us to do. All right, moving on into chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. So we get some instructions on the Passover. And some of this stuff I'm going to go through rather quickly, so over the course of these 4 weeks, we can cover the book of Numbers. I'm going a little slower maybe than I really need to. So really this chapter 9, it's the second Passover is what we can call that. And it's very specific. Again, a lot of this is, if you have been defiled by a dead body, you can't do the Passover. You've got to wait a month. And also, if you don't keep the Passover, you're cut off from the people. So God has a way of trying to keep the people close to Him. Instead of allowing someone who doesn't keep the Passover just to linger around, you need to separate yourself. This is God's instructions on how to keep His people close to Him. A stranger can keep the Passover if they're willing to do it according to the pattern given to the Israelites. And this stranger obviously is someone who's not an Israelite. All right, in chapter 9, starting in verse 15 on into 10, verse 10, you have the cloud and the trumpets. You're familiar with the cloud, and the cloud is going to be really a representation of God. And it's going to be as a pillar of fire at night. In verses 15 through 23, you read this. And the cloud would be moving during the march and remained at camp when they were sitting down and stationary. So here's the context, or the thing that we can take for us. We don't need to get ahead of God. And we can learn what happens when we try to get ahead of God in this book just a little bit later. But we don't need to go ahead of God. The trumpets, very specific. When you're getting ready to march, when you're getting ready to go war or to assemble, you're going to sound the alarm. Remember that the key verse of this Bible is right here that we read last week, and it had to do with when God sounds the alarm, or when you sound the alarm, God will remember you, and basically you're going to defeat your enemies. All right. Yeah, verse 9 is what that was. And we can go ahead and just read that again for context and remembrance. So Numbers chapter 10, I believe, if I can get there. The old digital Bible is not doing too well. If somebody got Numbers chapter 10, verse 9, if you would go ahead and read that. Brother Bob, you got that? Chapter 10, verse 9, yes, sir.
When you go to war in your land
Yes. That's the key verse that ties a lot of things in here. So moving on into the next section, if you will, looking at chapter 10, verses 11 through 18, we have the first march and their order. So everything is very detailed, the order you're supposed to be in as a tribe. Moses even gets some help here from a guy named Hobab, and he was, if you look at, let's see, chapter 10, verse 29. Now Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel the Midianites, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us and help us. So, there's a lot of detail in here that's very interesting. So this first trip, in verses 33 through 36, it's a 3-day journey, which in this book of Numbers is not really that long. This is not a very long journey. But again, we got 3 million people on a march for 3 days. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun. Very interesting setup. All of this should seem really awe-inspiring. All right, let's moving on in chapter 11. We're having some of these first real murmurings here. So we have a complaint from the people, and we have a result from the Lord. So let's go to chapter 11. Verse 1, now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them, and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord. The fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. So we got murmurings. They really don't get it. If you were to read on here, you should see that verse 4 through 9, there's more murmurings. They're still complaining. And in verse 5, oh, about the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks that we had, the onions and the garlic. Oh, back in Egypt. Oh, how good we had it back in Egypt. It was so awesome. Remember, God rescued them from Egypt because He heard them. He heard their cries, right? Remember the good old days there in verse 5, like I said. There is a specific part in here that's almost just, let's see here. They want some meat. They want all these things. I was trying to find a specific place, but at some point, it's in here somewhere. Basically, they say, I wish we just died in Egypt. I don't even want to be here. I just as soon died back in Egypt to be out here doing this. And then here's Moses. And as the teacher from World Video Bible School said, he says, Moses, bless his heart. Can you imagine? You're in charge of 3 million people. Obviously, God's in charge, but he's the pseudo leader here. Moses said, 10 through 15, I've had enough. And he's to the point like, kill me too. It literally says that in verse 15. If you're going to treat me this way, God, I didn't conceive these people. I didn't give birth to these people. Just go ahead and kill me. It literally says that in verse 15. An amazing thing. Some of you may have been through some of that before in your life. You're saying, I'm tired of dealing with these people. God, just go ahead and take me home now. But that's certainly the way that Moses felt at this time, given directly to us here. So with that said, God helps Moses. He's going to give him 70 people. They're in verses 16 through 17. They're supposed to verses 18 through 20. Well, God's going to give them the meat they want. God says He will give them meat for a month until they vomit it out their nose. You remember that. Everyone remembers that part of Numbers if you don't remember anything else. And Moses asks, how are you going to do this, God? Which is hilarious in some ways, but we do that too, don't we? Anytime we look at the book of Numbers, we can't be judging these people because we're no different. It's really we got to be focusing it back on us. We got to take what they did and just learn from it as we know Well, we can't be judging these folks in the book of Numbers because we're no different. We've got to be super careful and look at ourselves. We have to be prayerful that we're not the murmurers, that we're not the complaining grumblers, we're not the disobedient, we're not the ones sowing discord. But God answers Moses about how he goes, in verse 22, has my arm been shortened? Are you saying I can't do this? Jehovah shares his spirit with all these men to help Moses. God can get done whatever he wants to do. He can do whatever he wants. And that is something to learn here in this context for sure. So these quail that come in, how many quail is it, you think? You've got 3 million people. Now, I'm not saying that every person, all these 3 million, are going to get quail. But let's look at this here. Verses 31 through 35. This is amazing. You've got quail for a mile all around, 2 feet high. That's crazy. That's a lot of quail. And in verse 33, while the meat was still in their teeth, God strikes the murmurers dead. He just does not put up with it. And sometimes we think, man, God, he struck these people down just kind of quickly, didn't he? These people knew better. God, everything in the book of Numbers in the Bible that we have is here for our learning. But there's a lot of things that happen that we don't know about. We don't have every single detail that took place. These people have probably been complaining for a long time. They got plenty of problems. You know, sometimes our kids remember when we discipline them, but we sometimes discipline after they had done a whole bunch of other stuff before that. What do they remember? They only really remember when we gave them that ultimate discipline sometimes. So these people have been complaining for a while. They didn't say, oh, we won't meet, and God strikes some of them dead. No, there's a lot going on here. They're just a complaining group, and we have to look at ourselves and make sure we're not doing that same thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the book of Numbers, and it's going to continue on, And here's Miriam in chapter 12. So Miriam, I'm a terrible person at remembering the things that I've learned in the past. If you were to ask me a week ago, who's Miriam, I'd be like, somebody in the Bible. But it's Moses' sister. And Moses' sister Miriam is mad because he's going to marry a Ethiopian. I didn't even remember that Moses married an Ethiopian woman. The book of Numbers is full of all kinds of crazy tidbits that most of us, I don't think, recall. I certainly do not. But guess what? God is not excited about Miriam bringing this complaint. So this is about pride. And God declares in verse 3, this is interesting. I don't recall ever learning this, but it is very interesting. God declares that Moses is the most humble, which is interesting because we get toward the end here and he gets in trouble for pride. So all this really says is we're all vulnerable. Even the most humble of us can mess up. And that's okay, right? As long as we're always trying to do better. But Miriam gets in big time trouble. And Moses and Aaron intercede for her. Actually, Aaron gets a little bit, he kind of gets wrapped up into this too. Neither one of them are real excited about Moses marrying this Ethiopian woman. But Moses intercedes for her. And she's put outside the camp for 7 days. She's got some discipline that's going to take place. All right. So in chapter 13, we have unbelief and defeat. You guys know this particular part of Numbers very well. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But you know that the people are supposed to search out the land. They're supposed to search out this land that God has promised to them. They're supposed to see, are the people weak or strong? Is the land good or bad? Is there good fruit, not good fruit? All this stuff. Are there any forests? Just some details, right? You know that Joshua and Caleb are there. And the spies go into the land for 40 days. Remember the 40 days, right? So, verse 30 says, from Caleb, we can do this. And the people, verses 31 through 3. No, we can't. So they're saying in our own eyes, this is how they view themselves. They're giants. They think we're grasshoppers. We view ourselves as not able, and they see us as not very capable. This is just a mind game with these people. And there's one thing I failed to mention at this point. There's one other character in the book of Numbers that plays an enormous role that's not mentioned. Probably the biggest character in the book of Numbers that does not get mentioned. Plays one of the biggest roles, and it's the devil. Why are these people murmuring? Why are they complaining? Why are they not going and taking the land God gave them? The devil's trying to take the church, folks. He loves it. Absolutely loves it. Nothing better than destroying a congregation, and that should make us sick to our stomachs. And that's why we have elders, and that's what we're going to get to here before too long. The congregation wants to stone Joshua and Caleb in verse 10. You've got two men who were awesome and are trying to do their job and trying to do what they should for the Lord, and the people are going to stone them. I don't remember that in verse 10. God's leaders are about to get stoned. Verses 11 through 12, God will destroy the people and again offer to make a great nation of Moses. There's a lot to that, and it's an amazing story. Only Joshua and Caleb are going to live. And guess how long they're going to wander in the wilderness? You know the answer to that. They're going to wander a year for every day they went in to spy out the land. 40 days, 40 years. God's are very interesting in the way He does things. And then these details here in Numbers are no different. All but Joshua and Caleb are going to die of this plague. And one thing I don't recall from the book of Numbers is in verses 39 through 45. All right, so they went in, they said, we can't do it. Then Moses declares, and God says, you're going to have all these problems. You're going to be disciplined for it. Your children are going to take this land. But guess what? Then there's some people say, oh, we're going to go ahead and do it now. We're going to go ahead and take this land. We can do this. But God's not involved. The ark's not involved. And in verses 39 through 45, they go in. And they can't take the land. They didn't do it with God. You can't get ahead of God. You can't do it without Him. The ark did not go in with them. Moses did not go in with them. They went without the Lord. All right, chapter 15. Laws and sanctions. So there's lots of little details, interesting details here about how they're supposed to do certain things. So various laws concerning sacrifice. That's verses 1 through 31. So those same laws apply to anybody who wants to try to become an Israelite or a stranger that wants to be a proselyte. Verse 30. If someone blasphemes, they're to be put to death. That is interesting detail as we get into the New Testament, and they would always bring up this charge of blasphemy because they want to kill somebody in the New Testament. But God really instituted this. If someone really truly does blaspheme, they were to be put to death in verse 30. Also, in verses 32 through 36, there is another death penalty that we're aware of. And another thing the Pharisees really tried to hang on to, but they tried to twist it and make more out of it than it really was. And it was about this Sabbath breaking. You break the Sabbath, you'll be put to death. In verses 37 through 41, an interesting thing here. I think it's interesting to read. It's not just really awe-inspiring, if you will, here in chapter 15. I've got to see if my Bible will do what it's supposed to do. All right. So chapter 15, verse 37. God's Word is special. What He tells us to do is exceptionally special. And I hope that we can learn that from the book of Numbers. And I think here at Riverbend and other congregations, we really do preface the importance of that. We do it, and we want to do it because we want to honor God, not because we think we're so awesome, but we do it to try to protect ourselves. We do it to try to protect our children, our grandchildren, the future of the church. Let's look at what God instructs the people to do here in this time. Verse 37, again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel. Tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. Why a blue thread in the tassels? God said so. That's as simple as that, right? And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined, and that you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy for your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. How come we don't do tassels now with blue thread in them? God's given us the Word. He's given us the church. But you see that they didn't really have things written down in a book they could carry around, and God wanted them to have a visual. We need to also be very visual in how we act, how we live. You know, if I sit here and teach Bible class on Sunday morning, but I've got whiskey in the cabinets and beer in the fridge, that ain't too good, is it? I got to live the life that I need to live for God. All right, so 16. This is my just chapter here. This is such a thing that kind of gets you, and gets you from a church standpoint, and how we as a church should be just super respectful. Chapter 16. Let's turn with me there. All right. So let's just go ahead and read here. Verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Issachar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan, Abiram, and the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Pelath, sons of Reuben, here we go, took men, and they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. These are apparently somewhat important people, they thought. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? So, Moses, appointed by God, appointed leader, and here's 250 stirred up by this person named Korah, who's a Levite, already supposed to be blessed with the opportunity to be set apart and as close to God as needful. And he goes against some Reubenites, that Dathan and Abiram. And here's Moses in verse 4. So when Moses heard it, he fell on his face, and he spoke to Korah and his company, saying, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near to him. That one whom he chooses, he will cause to come near to him. And he tells him to take a censer. He tells all these men, you're going to take a censer. So, the thing that we can learn here that just really hits home is that what these people have ultimately done. What have they done when they questioned the authority of Moses? And that's sobering. They have questioned God's authority. And in the church, we have elders, and if they are biblical, scriptural, qualified elders, we have a duty to follow them. God instituted it. It's His. And when we go against the eldership in today's church, qualified elders, we're going against God. The men are important for God's service, but it's bigger than that. It's so much bigger than that. The murmurings, the complaining, it's so much bigger. It's got to be about God in the end. That's why we have the respect for elders, because it's God's institution. It's His Scripture that gives them authorization to be who they are, and it's not a job to be lifted up in a worldly sense at all. It's a servant's role. Moses is like, kill me now. There might have been some elders over the years said, just put me out of my misery, God. These people are wearing me thin. An amazing thing here, this group Korah. And we can look at this here in verse 11. We can read it. I didn't just make that up. So chapter 16, verse 11. Therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. And what is Aaron that you complain against him? An amazing thing. And then guess what? They get right into verses 12 through 14. They say, Moses, you're the reason we couldn't get into Canaan's land. You're the problem, Moses. We could have took the land if it wasn't for you. They're going to blame it on him. Place the blame. We could have done a better job than you. And they all gather together, verses 15 through 19, in front of the tabernacle. They got these censers they were supposed to get. And verses 20 through 31, separate yourselves from evil men. God tells them, hey, I'm fixing to take these gentlemen down. You better get away from them. Moses is saying, hey, and Aaron is saying, we got to save the people here, God. You can't just destroy all these folks because of these particular men. And God says, separate yourselves. 31 through 35, let's look at this together. Verses 31 through 35, chapter 16 in Numbers. Now it came to pass, as he finished speaking all these words, that the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and with their households and all the men with Korah, with all their goods. Is that a small thing? These men were swallowed up by the ground. And in some translations, I find it very interesting. I'd like to look at it deeper. It says that Korah and these men went into Sheol alive. I don't know if that's the best translation, but that's what the ESV says. You went into the place of the dead alive. Now, other translations don't call it that way. They just call it the pit. Either way, it sounds pretty terrible. They were at the very least buried alive. A pretty terrible thing, obviously. And they did it because of pride. They destroyed their lives and the people around them. And guess what? Their wives and their kids. They took their wives and their kids with their pride into the ground. How sad. And how much more important is this for us to live godly lives best we can for our spouses and our children, the next generation in God's holy church. Well, it doesn't end there. We haven't finished it quite yet. So in verse 33, we'll read it, what I just mentioned there. So they and all those with them went down alive into the pit. That's the New King James. The earth closed over them, and they perished from among the assembly. Verse 34, then all Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up too. A sobering moment. As mentioned earlier, we wished it was more sobering. When we see God, when we see the eldership try to do some healthy church discipline We've got to sit back and observe and say, this is a teachable moment. How can I apply this to me? How can I better follow God? And here we go, one last little bit here, some last few details. Verse 35. So God's not done. This is serious. And a fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. So there's these families with their spouses and their kids. They fall into the pit. And then you've got more people on top of that. It gets a little confusing here as you read it. It sounds like there's 250 and then there's an additional 250. But either way, there's a lot of people that are killed here. And this is just kind of getting into the beginning. Many thousands are going to die from plagues, the murmurings. 250 are destroyed by fire. 41 through 45, this is our take-home lesson here, guys. You've seen some people just fall into a pit, or at the very least, you heard about it happening. Verse 41, on the next day, all the congregation of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. Now what happened? When the congregation had gathered against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tabernacle of meeting, and suddenly the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of meeting. They complained again, one more time, in that particular account. It's been a blessing to be with you this morning. Loving the book of Numbers. We got 2 more weeks of it. Thank y'all.